The stones of Buckingham Palace have absorbed silence for generations. Not the gentle hush of peace, but a heavy, suffocating stillness, forged from truths that were never allowed to breathe. This is not a silence that fades with time. It settles. It watches. It remembers. It has swallowed confessions whole, buried scandals beneath layers of tradition, learned how to survive outrage and wait for it to pass. This silence knows the echo of footsteps long after they disappear. It knows who walked these halls by choice, and who walked them because duty left no alternative. Every corridor carries a memory it refuses to release. Every doorway has overheard conversations history was never meant to keep. Every painting, every carefully preserved royal gaze, stands not as decoration, but as a witness, listening, waiting. And on that night, as rain traced slow, deliberate paths down the towering palace windows, like grief that refused to fall freely, something irreversible began to take shape inside those walls. There was no dramatic outburst, no raised voices, no slammed doors, no announcement to the world, just a decision forming quietly, patiently, a decision that would not simply alter one man's life, but place the future of the monarchy itself at risk. Prince William sat alone at his desk. The room around him was vast, immaculate, and cold in that uniquely royal way, magnificent to behold, yet impossible to feel at ease within. The ceilings loomed high above. The air felt thick, unmoving, as if even it understood the weight of what was unfolding. A single lamp burned beside him. Its warm glow offered no comfort. Instead, it cast long, distorted shadows across the walls, shapes that stretched and shifted like silent observers, lingering just beyond sight. Spread across the polished surface of the desk lay a collection of documents. Not casual papers, not routine briefings. Crimson folders, dark, rigid spines, each one sealed with authority, each one stamped with the same unforgiving word: confidential. Page after page told the same story in different language. Legal analyses detailing exposure and risk. Reputation forecasts predicting public reaction. Crisis strategies calculating fallout, timelines, and damage control. Every paragraph measured. Every sentence cautious. Every conclusion chillingly precise. And again, like a wound that refused to close, the same name surfaced. Not screamed across tabloid headlines. Not whispered through gossip columns or online speculation, but embedded deep within formal language. Carefully referenced. Coldly documented. Jeffrey Epstein. It was no longer just a name. No longer a disgraced figure confined to the past. It had become a symbol, an emblem of everything the palace could not fully explain. A shadow trailing the royal family into every interview, every documentary, every carefully staged public appearance. No matter how tightly the institution closed its doors, that presence slipped through. In questions reporters weren't supposed to ask. In pauses that lasted too long. In answers that sounded rehearsed, because they were. William leaned back slowly and closed his eyes. The weight pressing against his chest was not fear, not panic. It was heavier than that. It was inheritance. The crushing realization that being born into the crown meant never truly escaping its consequences. It was duty, cold, relentless, and absolute. A duty that demanded silence, even when that silence had begun to cost too much.
Absolutely. My grandmother and my father are 150% supportive behind everything I'm doing. And Harry and Catherine, they very much understand, whilst my grandmother is still extremely active at the helm of the royal family as the monarch, my father is incredibly busy with his charitable activities and other responsibilities. There's the time now and the space to explore other means of doing a worthwhile job, and for me the air ambulance is an incredible important part. It's not going to last forever, but I think it's important.
Inside the palace, belief was the most fragile currency of all. It couldn't be legislated. It couldn't be enforced. And once fractured, it rarely returned in the same form. Prince William opened his eyes and looked back down at the documents. The language was careful, engineered by advisors who understood that words could either smother a fire or feed it. Nothing was stated outright. Everything was implied. Possible exposure, secondary associations, reputational contamination. Each phrase was designed to prevent panic. Yet together, they formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. The monarchy had survived wars, abdications, divorces, scandals, waves of public fury. But this was different. This wasn't about a single mistake, or even a single individual. This was about proximity. about who had been seen, who had been photographed, who had been present, and who had remained silent, long enough for that silence to begin looking like complicity. William had grown up with one rule above all others: never become the story. The crown endured by remaining just out of reach, symbolic, distant, composed, human enough to be admired, but never close enough to be examined too closely. Now the story was closing in. Every investigation reopened old wounds. Every resurfaced photograph reignited conversations the palace had spent years trying to bury. And every refusal to comment only sharpened suspicion. The public no longer asked if there was more. They asked who knew and when. William's gaze drifted back toward the window. Beyond the glass stretched a nation wrestling with uncertainty, political instability, cultural division, a future that felt increasingly unfamiliar. In moments like these, people didn't demand perfection from institutions. They demanded reassurance, steadiness, continuity, the sense that someone somewhere was still in control. And for better or worse, one day that responsibility would rest entirely on him. William wasn't naive. He understood that the monarchy was not held together by crowns or ceremonies, but by perception, by trust, by the belief that those who inherited power were worthy of it. Lose that belief, and no amount of tradition could save what followed. The files on his desk didn't demand a decision. They didn't need to. They simply waited, because every day of silence narrowed the available options. Every delayed response allowed others, journalists, commentators, critics, to define the narrative instead. And the most dangerous stories were always the ones you didn't tell yourself. William exhaled slowly. Whatever choice lay ahead would be judged not only by the public, but by history. By a future generation asking whether this was the moment the crown chose to protect itself, or the moment it finally chose accountability. And somewhere deep beneath the palace, beneath the stone, the ceremony, and the silence built over centuries, the institution itself seemed to hold its breath.
But I think the royal family has to modernize and develop as it goes along, and it has to stay relevant. And that's the challenge for me, is how do I make the royal family relevant in the next 20 years' time? And you know, it could be 40 years' time, it could be 60 years' time, I have no idea when.
William opened another folder. This one was thicker, heavier, as if the paper itself carried guilt. Images stared back at him from glossy pages, moments frozen in time, stripped of context and mercy. Photographs that once felt harmless now appeared deliberate. Every smile re-examined, every background face enlarged, every detail scrutinized. Timelines ran down the pages in clean, unforgiving lines. Dates connected to meetings. Meetings linked to travel. Travel overlapping with moments that, in hindsight, should never have intersected at all. Events once dismissed as coincidence now appeared structured, patterned, impossible to ignore. Advisors' notes crowded the margins, boxed in angry red ink. Risk, exposure, irreversible. The same words circled again and again. Some lines were underlined so forcefully the paper nearly tore. Every document delivered the same warning, just dressed in different language. If the crown protects Andrew, the world will turn on the crown. Not slowly, not cautiously, completely. The second hand on the clock sliced through the silence. Each tick landed with precision, sharp, measured, final. This wasn't a march toward embarrassment. This was a march toward consequence, toward a moment history would replay endlessly, asking the same question from every angle. Why didn't they act when they still could? Behind him, the balcony door creaked softly. William didn't turn. He didn't need to. Some sounds required no explanation. Kate entered quietly, her movements instinctively careful, as if something within her understood she was stepping into a moment that could never be undone. She said nothing at first. She didn't have to. The air in the room shifted the instant she arrived. The tension changed shape. Less isolated. More real. She looked at the desk, at the folders, at the clock. Then at him. "You haven't rested," she said gently, her voice low enough to respect the gravity of the room. William exhaled, offering a smile meant only for her, practiced, restrained, designed to reassure without revealing anything at all. "My thoughts won't let me," he replied. They moved toward the window together, standing side by side without touching. From this height, London looked calm, almost peaceful. Lights shimmered. Traffic flowed. People laughed, argued, lived entire lives unaware of how close the institution they trusted stood to fracture. From a distance, the city seemed indifferent, as if nothing happening inside the palace mattered at all. But they knew better. This choice isn't about now. Kate said at last, her reflection faint in the glass. It's about what comes next. She paused, not because she lacked words, but because speaking them made everything permanent. It's about George, she continued quietly. Charlotte. Lewis. The names landed heavier than any legal briefing ever could. William swallowed. His throat tightened, not from fear, but from clarity. It's about what our name becomes when they're grown, he said. What it means when they're old enough to read history and see where we stood. Rain continued its slow descent down the windows, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and white. Somewhere in the distance, London breathed on, unaware that inside Buckingham Palace, the future of the crown was being weighed not by ceremony or tradition, but by a family standing at a window, deciding which legacy was worth protecting.
And I certainly don't lie awake waiting or hoping for it, because it sadly means that my family have moved on, and I don't want that.
William pictured his children running freely across the palace lawns, their laughter cutting through the weight of history like something pure, untouched. In his mind, they were unburdened. No cameras, no protocols, no expectations stitched into their names. Just children, small fingers wrapped around his hand, unquestioning trust in his presence. A belief that right and wrong were simple, clearly drawn lines that didn't blur under pressure. That certainty hurt the most, because William's world had never been simple. It was layered, complicated, built on compromise stacked upon compromise, until clarity became something you only reached by surrendering something else along the way. Behind sealed doors, the palace had already begun to shift. Quietly, deliberately. Meetings stretched beyond their scheduled hours, drifting late into the night as no one wanted to be the first to say what everyone already knew. Hallways that once hummed with routine now felt narrower, heavier. Staff lowered their voices without realizing it, instinctively sensing that sound itself had become dangerous. Conversations changed. Advisors who once spoke plainly now chose words with surgical precision. Every syllable was weighed, tested, restrained, as if it might one day be read aloud in a courtroom transcript or lifted out of context and splashed across a front-page headline. Nothing was said casually anymore. Nothing was said without imagining consequences. And through it all, the message remained unwavering. The public does not separate a man from the institution. Titles do not insulate. Bloodlines do not excuse. Distance does not absolve. Prince Andrew's history no longer belonged solely to him. It no longer existed as a private failing or a contained scandal. It belonged to the crown. Every photograph, every association, every unanswered question attached itself not just to one individual, but to the symbol itself. And looming over everything was Epstein. Not as a headline screaming for attention, but as a shadow that refused to move. Unresolved, unspoken, impossible to outrun. The absence of answers only made that presence stronger. No press conferences, no official statements, no internal memos that dared to name it directly, no staff, no records, no paper trail, just silence. And silence, William knew better than anyone, was never empty. It filled itself with assumptions, with suspicion, with stories waiting to be told by someone else. Inside Buckingham Palace, the machinery of tradition continued to turn, but now it did so under strain. Each movement echoed with the same unasked question: how much silence could the crown afford before silence became its undoing?
I think royal duty is extremely important. I think it's part of the fabric of what the royal family and any future monarch has, and it's something that is very important, and I take duty very seriously. I take my responsibilities very seriously, but it's about finding your own way at the right time, and if you're not careful, duty can sort of weigh you down an awful lot.
Just two brothers stood facing one another in a silent room, divided by far more than the polished table between them. There were no advisors present, no witnesses hiding behind protocol, no ceremony to soften the moment. Only the clock. Its steady ticking marked time with indifference, as if history itself had leaned closer to watch. Andrew stood rigid, arms folded tight across his chest. His posture was defensive, almost defiant. His jaw clenched so hard it looked painful, as though anger were the only thing holding him upright. His eyes burned with something that resembled rage, but beneath it sat something heavier, something closer to betrayal. "So that's it," Andrew said at last, his voice sharp enough to cut through the stillness. "You're siding with them." He gestured vaguely, not needing to name who they were. The press, the critics, the outsiders who had never lived behind palace walls. The headlines, Andrew continued, The noise. William rose slowly from his chair. There was no urgency in the movement, no performance, just inevitability. "I'm not siding with them," he said calmly. "I'm siding with the crown." Andrew let out a short, hollow laugh, the kind that carried no humor at all. "The crown," he echoed, tasting the words. "Not your brother." The accusation hung between them. For a moment, William wanted to answer immediately. Emotion surged, uninvited, unwelcome. Memories pressed forward. Childhood moments shared in corridors meant for staff, not children. Growing up beneath the same roof, bound by the same rules, shaped by the same relentless expectations. They had been boys together long before they became symbols. But those memories no longer carried authority here. "This can't be personal," William said at last, forcing his voice to remain steady. "It has to be bigger than us." Andrew shook his head slowly, disbelief carved across his face. "That's how you survive it," he replied, "by pretending it isn't." Silence collapsed between them. Not the calm kind. Not the kind that heals. This silence was heavy. Absolute. The kind that presses inward until something gives. And something did. Not with raised voices. Not with slammed fists or dramatic exits. But with a quiet fracture, subtle, final, the kind of break that never truly repairs, no matter how much time passes. After that night, nothing was officially announced. No press release. No statement from the palace. No proclamation explaining what had changed. There was only absence. Andrew's name began to disappear quietly from guest lists. His appearances grew fewer, then non-existent. His image slipped from the carefully curated portrait of the monarchy, edited away without acknowledgement. The institution did what it had always done best. It erased. The media noticed immediately. They always do. Pundits leaned forward into studio cameras. Analysts filled airtime with speculation delivered as certainty. Headlines assembled themselves with ruthless efficiency. Some praised the move as fearless, necessary, proof of a modern monarchy willing to protect itself, no matter the cost. Others condemned it as cold, calculated, a brother quietly sacrificed to preserve power. William read every word. Late at night, when the palace finally slept, he sat alone beneath the glow of a screen, scrolling through judgments from people who would never understand what it meant to carry centuries of expectation on your back. Every opinion felt heavy, every headline permanent. Kate sometimes found him there, still dressed, long past midnight, eyes tired but alert. "You're still a man," she would say softly, reminding him of something the world seemed eager to forget. And he would answer just as quietly, "The world isn't asking for a man." He paused every time, because saying the next word made it real. It's asking for a king.
I think just the qualities that are essential for somebody in a leadership role. I think it's important to grow into a particular role with the right characteristics and the right qualities, and I think she's exemplified that in everything she's done.
The Epstein narrative refused to fade. It didn't disappear beneath statements or carefully worded denials. It didn't dissolve with time or distraction. Instead, it evolved. It lived on through documentaries that replayed the same images until they burned into public memory. Through whispered conversations held just loudly enough to be overheard. Through unanswered questions that traveled faster than any official explanation ever could. The name became more than a reference to one man or one scandal. It became shorthand, a symbol for everything people believed power concealed behind closed doors. A reminder that influence often came with insulation, and that insulation rarely cracked on its own. For the public, it bred suspicion. For critics, it served as confirmation. For the institution, it remained an open wound that refused to scar over. And for William, it marked a turning point. Not a moment captured by cameras. Not a speech. Not an announcement. But a quiet realization. He had crossed an invisible line, the line separating inheritance from ownership. From that moment on, the weight no longer belonged to the past. It belonged to him. Sleep became elusive. He began pacing the palace corridors long after midnight, his footsteps echoing softly across stone floors polished by centuries of authority. These were the hours when the building felt most alive and most judgmental. He passed painted faces frozen in time, rulers preserved at the height of certainty, eyes trained outward to project strength, stability, inevitability. Kings who never imagined being questioned, queens who never imagined being recorded, figures who ruled in eras where silence meant obedience, and scrutiny was a luxury few possessed. Their gazes followed him as he walked, not accusing, not forgiving, only observing. William wondered what they would have done, which lines they would have crossed, and which they would have refused to cross to preserve what they believed the crown represented. The palace creaked and settled around him, reacting to his movement, reminding him that institutions remember, that decisions made in silence echo longer than those made in public. And somewhere between shadow and portrait, between legacy and consequence, William understood something with absolute clarity. There was no version of this story where everyone remained whole. Only a version where the crown survived, and a version where it didn't. Their eyes followed him, not with accusation but with recognition. William felt it as he walked, a quiet acknowledgement passing between generations, as if those painted rulers understood exactly where he now stood, the moment no ceremony ever prepares you for. He wondered what they had surrendered to sit where they sat, which siblings they had left behind when loyalty became inconvenient, which friendships they had allowed to wither in the name of continuity, which loves they had silenced, hidden, or reshaped to meet the demands of power. How many pieces of themselves had been buried, deliberately, permanently, so that the crown could appear whole? Because the crown, he finally understood, was never a jewel. It was gravity. It pulled everything toward it: family, identity, morality, bending them until they fit its shape. It was isolation disguised as privilege, distance mistaken for dignity. It was the knowledge that every decision costs something you will never recover, and that no one tells you what that cost is until it's already gone. One evening, his steps slowed before a familiar frame. A family portrait. A younger version of himself stood beside Andrew, both smiling easily, both unaware of how narrow the path ahead would become. There was no calculation in those faces, no awareness of duty, just brothers, unguarded, unarmored, untouched by consequence. William stood there longer than he intended. Time seemed to hesitate with him. "I never wanted this," he whispered, the words barely audible even to himself. But I couldn't let it collapse. The confession wasn't meant for history, or for forgiveness. It was simply the truth, spoken too late to change anything. Outside, the flag above the palace moved steadily in the night air, measured, controlled, a symbol designed to suggest permanence, unshaken, uninterrupted, eternal. Inside those walls, a man stood alone, not a monarch, not yet, just someone carrying the invisible cost of preserving something larger than himself. Because in the end, royalty is not about bloodlines or birthright. It isn't about crowns or ceremonies. It's about structure. And structures endure through sacrifice, quietly, repeatedly, without apology. The palace remains. The gates still open and close on schedule. The world continues to watch, analyze, debate, and judge from a distance. But somewhere beyond those walls, long after the lights dim and the corridors fall silent, a future king lies awake, staring into the dark, haunted by a single question, repeating without mercy: did I protect the crown, or did I disappear inside it?